Good morning, Donald West. Hope you've all had a good week. We are starting a two-part series looking at the book of Daniel. Over these next 2 weeks, I'll be opening up the first 6 chapters of the book over these next 2 weeks and having a look at them. The book of Daniel is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It's famous for the lion's den, for the blazing furnace. Perhaps you know it as well for some of the strange visions Daniel has and other characters have in this book. It was quite a significant book for Jesus as well, it seems, and so it should probably be significant for us too. The book has loads of great truths and stories in it, especially in the first half, which are the easier to read, and I would say also easier to apply to our lives. The second half is trickier, and so I'm going to take the easy option for these next 2 weeks and focus on the first half. And I want to highlight a couple of themes in the book that what we can learn about following Jesus in today's culture. Because that's exactly what Daniel and his friends deal with. How can they and we be faithful to God in a world that is doing everything in its power to pull us away from Him? To make us feel strange or perhaps even cruel to follow the teachings of the Bible and the way of life laid down by Jesus? When there's so many things in the world around us that we can give our allegiance to, our time, our money, our energy, how do we stay true to God, even if it's perhaps the unfashionable thing to do? And that's what this story, set over 2,500 years ago, talks about. If you ever think the Bible has nothing to say today, or you wonder how it can be relevant to living in Ireland in 2020, then the book of Daniel is one of the best places to look and be proved wrong. So over these next few Sundays, we'll take a whistle-stop tour through the first 6 chapters of Daniel and see what it has to say about some of the biggest areas of life and faith. Daniel and his 3 friends, best known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're kind of the heroes of the story as far as human characters are concerned. The villains are then a succession of Babylonian rulers, wise men, and leaders. Daniel and his friends are taken as young men, probably teenagers, from their home in Israel. Israel had been defeated, and as predicted by many of the prophets, they have gone into exile in Babylon. It's one of the worst times in history to be a Jew. Those that are still alive have been taken away from their home and have been placed in a foreign land. Daniel's friends, in fact, might be some of the lucky ones. Not only are they still alive, but they seem to probably have been members of the elite back home, and so they are handpicked to have the best Babylonian education available. On a scholarship, because they'll be well-fed, housed, and almost guaranteed jobs in the service of the empire when they've finished. The only downside is they'll be brainwashed, indoctrinated to forget everything about who they are, where they come from, and what they believe. But I guess at least they won't have a huge mountain of student debt. So that's the scene we're set with at the beginning of the book. These 4 young men are taken from their homes, their families, and everything they know and love, and they're forced into a system which will do everything in its power to change their identity, to fit the mold, to conform to the way things are done here. Does that sound at all familiar? What the 4 men believe about life and God doesn't really matter anymore. That's what Babylon say, and what Babylon says goes, or at least that's the idea. What we see over the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel is a remarkable story of how these 4 young men persist in their faith whilst achieving quite a lot of worldly success. They manage to stick to their beliefs and principles while serving and even perhaps caring for their captors and the city and empire that crushed their own people. 4 men who know when to stand firm, when to trust in God, and when to show compassion and perhaps even allegiance to their masters. A paradox, if ever there was one. Because how can someone love God and yet do the best for their neighbor when their neighbor is telling them to stop loving God? How can someone speak with calmness and love, but also truth to those in power? But the real hero of the book of Daniel, like the rest of the Bible, is God. The real message of the story is how God is in control and always has been, of how God will protect and provide for his people, of how God can and will use, as we see throughout the Bible, anyone he chooses to show his glory and his power and his plan for the world. No matter how powerful we may think we are, no matter how much we look at the world and think perhaps it's a mess or it's out of control, no matter how much we can't see the sunshine through the clouds, God is there. God is in control, and God has a plan. And in fact, we have an even better view of things than the first readers of Daniel or Daniel himself, because we see more of that plan than anyone else, because we see the true story and true plan through Jesus. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light. He is the ruler of the world. No one else And one day, he will exercise that authority to the full and forever. God is sovereign, and no book in the Bible shows that better than Daniel. And that's what I want us to think about for a short while this morning. I don't know about you, but when I look back over the past few months, and in fact the past few years, it seems as if the world is more and more out of control. The coronavirus pandemic, incredible political decisions all around us, climate chaos, and there's perhaps more division than ever before in the world, or at least it's easier for us to see it. The news cycle is incredibly quick. In many ways, I imagine it's the best and worst time to be a politician or a leader. Thanks to social media, everyone can share their opinion with you, which I'm sure is great fun. But new things seem to be happening at such an alarming rate that whatever you said or did that group of people didn't like will probably be quickly forgotten. It's perhaps most obvious in the US, but even here it feels like the general election was years ago when it was really just back at the end of February. To some extent, we've all kind of forgotten about Brexit, but the deadline keeps on ticking closer. And if you remember those climate change protests all the way back last year. I think it's not that my memory or our memories are getting shorter, but we're just overwhelmed by the media and news. It seems as if everything is spinning out of control, one major crisis after another, and most of us are lucky just to be carried along by it, wave after wave of news stories, scandals, problems, and we're just trying to keep afloat. If you read through the book of Daniel, you'll get the sense that he and his friends had a pretty action-packed life themselves. Kidnapped as young men, put into an education where they're instantly having to stand up for their beliefs and their faith in a way they would never have had to at home. They're having to deal with leaders of the largest empire in the world being threatened and having their life in the balance multiple times. It's definitely more than I could handle. But the one thing to note is that these 6 stories are spread over about 60 years, and so we don't really hear much about the day-to-day dealings of Daniel and his friends, but these are six significant episodes in their lives. The life of God's people in Israel more broadly as well, as they attempt to cling on to their identity, their place in the world. Because if anyone has a right to feel like the world was out of control, it was the Israelites, seemingly going from one empire crushing them to another, getting freed and delivered, followed by another one, and this exile was the worst that had happened, at least so far. So if that's the world they lived in, and we look around at the world around us today, how can we even begin to believe, let alone to actually claim out loud that God is in control? Because if I look around and think that he's in control, then clearly me and God have a different description as what control looks like. But I think that the answer doesn't really lie outside in the world. It's here in my heart and all of our hearts. What's going on inside us is what really matters, because this pandemic and all of the other issues going on right now and in the past few years, they don't really show us that God isn't in control, but they show us that we definitely aren't. And Daniel's life clearly shows that he wasn't in control either. From the very first chapter where the 4 young men are making a stand about not eating food from the king's table, God is in control, not Daniel, not his friends. God causes the official to show favor for Daniel's suggestion of eating just the vegetables. God then gives them knowledge and understanding. God helps Daniel interpret visions as he does in chapter 2, 4, and 5. He saves Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the blazing furnace in chapter 3, and it's God who closes the lions' mouths in chapter 6. Daniel and his friends, whilst they play their part by remaining faithful and prayerful, and we'll have a look at that more next week, they only make it through the story in one piece because of God. The Israelites were in exile because they'd abandoned God too many times. He'd had enough. But here in this story through Daniel, God shows us that no matter what things might look like from our eyes, he is always there and he's always in control. But I think the best illustration in the book of how God is sovereign isn't how he deals with Daniel or the three friends. It's instead how he deals with the most powerful man in the world, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is the man in charge for the first 4 chapters of this book, and we see that he's a very religious man, and he must have been quite intelligent and capable to have got to his position and to stay there for as long as he did. But he's also rather foolish at times. For example, in chapter 2, he has a dream which Daniel miraculously interprets for him and shows him that although his empire is great, it's the golden head part of the vision, it won't last forever, and that all those that will follow will be weaker and weaker until something a bit different seems to be happening. Nebuchadnezzar rightly recognizes that Daniel's God, our God, is the God of gods. He promotes Daniel, who then promotes his friends too. It seems like Nebuchadnezzar has a bit of a conversion experience, but really it seems all he's seen is that his empire is the greatest. And not only that, but in his lifetime it won't fall, so why should he care? If we then turn to chapter 3, this is laid out for us with clear irony as Nebuchadnezzar is seen building a massive golden statue. You really couldn't make it up, because this time we then see Nebuchadnezzar's angry side as he throws the 3 friends into the furnace as punishment for not worshipping the statue. He almost taunts them in verse 15 of chapter 3 when he says, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Well, perhaps the God who you've already claimed was the God of gods. That's who. But he's forgotten. He thinks he is in control. But when God protects the friends from the heat, he's again seeing God at work and seeing God's power. And this time, he goes a step further and claims that anyone saying anything about their God will be cut into pieces and their houses demolished. Oh, and the guys get another promotion as well, perhaps his way of saying sorry. So Nebuchadnezzar has been amazed at least twice so far in this story by God. He has seen that God has immense power, and he's been told back in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar himself is only in this position because God has given him that power. He's put him where he wanted him to be. And to some extent, he's believed these things, and he does acknowledge the power of Daniel's God. But then in chapter 4, we see a shift. We hear, this time from Nebuchadnezzar himself. And this time, it seems that he really does believe in God at the end. He really does worship him. And in fact, his final words in the whole Bible are pretty spectacular. Take a look at chapter 4, verse 37 for yourself. But even in this story, it's God who shows him who's in charge. And even with all the evidence he's seen, the king still is oblivious to it. He has another dream, and this time Daniel tells him that God is going to humble him and then some. This mighty king will become no better than the animals in the field. He'll lose his mind. And why is this going to happen? Well, verse 17 tells us, "So that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth." This is what the book of Daniel is about. God is in charge. So Daniel warns him to repent. He says, "Turn away from the wickedness and the bad way you've been living and be kind." But clearly Nebuchadnezzar doesn't heed those warnings. As then we skip forward to verse 29, a year later, and we have him walking around his palace. And in verse 30 he says, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" We almost read it and think, how does he not get it? It's not about you. You aren't the one in power, and you've been shown that. How do you not understand? You couldn't burn the friends in the furnace. You might be the golden head, but in your time, the empire will fall. God will start a kingdom that will surpass all others, and he's been told by Daniel that he's only in control because God allowed him to be. And because of his arrogance and wickedness, and to show him who's boss, he's going to take it all from Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what happens in verse 31, even as the words were on his lips. The king's authority is mine, his power is wealth, taken from him in an instant. And not only that, but it's God who then returns it to him in verse 34. And now Nebuchadnezzar seems to get it. "Then I praised the Most High. His dominion is an eternal one. His kingdom endures. All the people, including the king, are nothing. He does as he pleases. No one can hold back his hand." The most powerful man in the world, the King of Kings, he's finally seen the truth. He's not in control. He doesn't have the power. God is in control. God has the power. Today in Ireland, we often act like we're the kings of our own lives. I definitely do. We believe it's our right to have this or that. We plan this or that. We think we need to be able to have as much choice as we want in everything we do. In the world, for us, and most of us that are going to be watching and listening to this today, we have more options and opportunities than ever before. And we're kind of arrogant enough to think that we've done this. Progress and development, new discoveries of science and technology, they've given us more control over life, death, the world, and each other than ever before. But clearly we're not in control. The pandemic has shown us that. The Western world has been brought crashing to its knees, and the rest of the world to some extent, by a virus that is 1,000th of a millimeter in size. If there's ever an event to show us that we're not in control and how we're not in control, and that our leaders aren't in control, then surely this is it. Because God is in control, and thank God for that. Because whether we like to admit it or not, we are pretty powerless. And not only that, but the power we do have, we often don't use in the right way. We're selfish just like the king. We're forgetful just like the king. We're arrogant just like the king. We think we've done it all. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego couldn't save themselves from the furnace. Daniel couldn't close the mouths of the lions. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't restore his sanity. Only God could do those things. And only God can save us. And we know, more than Daniel did, that God has saved us. God sent his Son to save us once and for all, not from pain or hardship, not completely yet, but from the ultimate villain, death. If we trust in him, then we can have courage from the victory that's been won, because the war has been won, even if the battle still continues on for now. We can't save ourselves any more than Daniel could save himself from the lions. No amount of progress or invention can do that, only God can. But we can choose how we live, and next week we'll look at Daniel and how he lives faithfully for God, trusting that he was in control and depending on him for everything, because he's a great example of that faith and trust. But Nebuchadnezzar can be a warning and an example to us as well. We can choose to be like the king in chapters 2 and 3, acknowledging God as in control, but living like we are. Or we can learn a lesson from Nebuchadnezzar. Can we own up to our own arrogance and self-centeredness? Or will we echo Nebuchadnezzar's final words? Praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Amen.